Hey, welcome back. And in this section, the final section of this video series, we're going to be covering the post-processing. So basically just turning the raw render from Blender into this final image that you see here. So let's get started with this. So the first thing I want to cover is this. So I have everything grouped within a single post-processing group. So this is just something I do pretty much every time I do post-processing. I like to just keep the raw render outside of a group and then all of the post work that I'm doing in a post work group. This way I can just turn it on and off whenever I need to, just so I can kind of see, the before and after and just make sure what I'm doing actually looks better than the raw render, because sometimes my eyes just get used to what I'm doing and then I'll, turn off the post-processing group and realize that it actually is kind of looking worse than it did before. So this is just a really good way to just be able to compare the two very easily whenever you need to. So I'm just going to turn off all of these layers right now. So I'm just going through, turning off the layers, and we're going to start from the first layer. So I have my raw render right here. And the first thing I'm going to usually bring in is the ambient occlusion pass. So you can see right here, the ambient occlusion pass it's set to overlay in a fill of 7. So if I just set this to normal and then a fill of 100, this is what the ambient occlusion pass looks like. So just setting this to overlay, you can see it actually just overlays on top of the raw render, and it just brings up the contrast quite a bit. It brightens a lot of things and darkens some of these shadows as well. And it obviously looks terrible at 100%. So I'll usually do a value of somewhere between 5 and 10%. So something very subtle. And you can see right here, it actually looks a lot better. So this just brightens up the image just slightly. It adds a little bit of extra contrast, but nothing too crazy. All right, so these two right here, so lighten and screen, these are very subtle effects. So if I zoom in, you might be able to tell the difference, but it's very subtle. It just kind of adds this little bit of blur to the image. And literally all this is, well, I'll just show you. So basically I just select ambient occlusion right here, and then I'm gonna go Control-Alt-Shift-E, and that's going to consolidate everything underneath the selected layer into one single image. And then I can go over to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and then generally I'll blur about this much, so around 30-ish or so, just to get a little bit of a blur. Click OK. And then what I can do is I can set this to first, lighten. So this right here is this layer, so it's set to lighten. And this just kind of gives you this kind of like dreamy blur effect. Obviously this looks really weird if it's at 100%, which is why I have this set to 10% in the actual layer. So when I start to lower this, you're gonna see this just kind of adds this nice kind of dreamy glow effect. And I like to keep this pretty subtle, so generally between 5 and 15%, sometimes a little bit higher, but I try not to go too crazy with this. And yeah, this is just this very, very subtle kind of blur that you don't really notice too much, but it does add this nice kind of dreamy effect. Okay, and then screen, this is essentially the exact same thing. I just set it from lighten to screen, and screen is just this much brighter look. So if I turn this all the way up, it's kind of similar, but it's a lot brighter. So I overlay this with a much lower fill amount, so 4%. This is pretty standard for a lot of my renders, like 2 to 4% or so. And yeah, this just brightens it up a little bit more with the same kind of dreamy glow effect. So these two right here are curves. So I have a darks and a lights curve. So this is essentially like me just kind of manually adjusting like the contrast and the lighting. So if I select this right now and go to the properties, the darks curve is just, it's bringing down the darks a bit. So if I turn this off, you're going to see this is just darkening certain sections, and I actually paint in a mask. So let me just show you kind of how I go about this. So I'm going to turn these off and I'm going to go to adjustments, create a curve. And what I'll do here is I'll start darkening this. So something like this about. And I'm not going to actually darken the entire image. As you can see, I'm actually using a mask, so I can actually control where this is actually affecting and where this is not affecting. So when I'm actually darkening this image with this curves, I'm only looking at the spots that I actually want to darken. So like these sections right here and like the shadows that I do actually want to keep darker, but I'm going to actually erase away this effect from like the focal point in the highlight section. So I'm only looking at the sections that I'm actually going to be darkening. So once I get a value I like, then I'm going to select this right here to select the mask. Click B to go to the brush tool and use something very soft like this, and then maybe like 25% or so on the flow. And now I have black and white right here. So if I paint black, that's going to be the opposite color on this mask. So basically I'm going to be able to actually erase away this effect when I paint black. So as you can see, when I start painting in, it actually brightens up the image a bit. So I'll just go through on all like the highlights and sections I actually want to keep brighter. I'm actually going to make this a little bit more subtle, like 5%. And I can actually just paint in like the highlights. So you can see right here, I'm brightening up the foreground, avoiding a lot of the shadowed sections, but kind of painting on the highlights a little bit more to brighten sections and kind of like the focal point. And then also you can kind of paint in some kind of God rays too. So like some streaks from the left into the focal point. So I'm not going to actually go through with the rest of this process for this because I already did it right here. But as you can see, I was able to control where I darkened and where I kept, the same as the original. And I also do this separately with lights. So I could actually just do like an S curve where I pull this down and then, pull up the highlights as well on the other side. And I could just keep that all in one curve, but I like being able to actually control the highlights and the darks separately, just because sometimes I actually need to have that full control. So I just do this separately and, just allows me a little bit more finer control to get the exact look I need. But yeah, you can just paint a mask and just kind of accentuate the contrast and highlights and shadows in the specific areas that you need much more easily this way. Okay, so this is where the image starts looking really nice. So Camera Raw is like 99% of my workflow for post-processing. So you can see right here, this is the first Camera Raw effect. And if you don't know how to actually use Camera Raw, you can actually just go Filter and then Camera Raw Filter right here. So let me access this. Okay, so this is Camera Raw. And Camera Raw is super powerful. So the first thing I generally will do is I click this button right here to show a side-by-side comparison of the before and after. So you can see what you did next to what it was before this effect. And Camera Raw just has a ton of different effects for you to just control your image and just adjust whatever you need. So in the light settings, you can see I adjust the exposure, the contrast, the highlights, the shadows, and all of that. So the shadows effect right here, this is really nice for like kind of bringing up the shadows and making them just slightly less dark. It kind of also helps with like the stylized look as well that I get. I still like to keep it pretty subtle because it can look pretty bad if you go, all the way like this. It just flattens out the image. But a small value is pretty nice though. But yeah, I'll bring down the highlights a little bit too. So generally I'll bring down the highlights just a little bit so that I can also bring up the exposure a little bit more without the highlights just kind of bleeding out too much. So that's just something I do as well a little bit. Let's go down to effects. So this does quite a bit for like just the crispness and like the sharpness of my image. So I use texture quite a bit in my images, as you can see. So before and after. So texture is really nice. It's kind of like the stylized sharpen filter. And I do actually sharpen the image as well. As you can see, I actually have pretty high sharpening too. But that in combination with texture is just really nice. So generally, I'll try to keep it between like 40 to sometimes 55 or so. If you go too crazy, it can look pretty weird because it's kind of like the stylized sharpen look. In this case, 100 actually doesn't look terrible or anything, but it just kind of makes the like the darks and the lights look a little bit fake sometimes if you go too high. I also use clarity sometimes, but clarity is, I don't know, I'm not the biggest fan of clarity. It looks better in like darker renders. So if you have like more like moody cinematic kind of darker lighting, then this can look a lot better. But generally like the style of renders that I do, texture looks really nice for it. It gives this kind of like painterly look. And then grain. So you can see the grain is pretty subtle. If I turn it off, it just kind of is something you notice only when you really zoom in. And I use a very low size and roughness a lot of the time because this actually makes the image feel a little bit sharper too. So I bring up the size and the roughness a bit. It just softens it a little bit more. So when you bring this closer to 0, it kind of just acts a lot sharper. And it kind of just feels like you're sharpening the image just slightly more too. And I just kind of like that look. So it's just kind of like a personal preference. All right, and then under detail, there's the sharpening, of course, which just kind of sharpens us a little bit more on top of the texture. Nothing too crazy. And yeah, so there's that. And yeah, I think that's about it for this. Let's go to here. So you also might have noticed that I actually am doing the color correction with the Camera Raw filter after the sharpening, and I don't do it directly inside of the same exact Camera Raw filter. And the reason for this is kind of similar to why I was doing these two separately with the darks and the lights with the curves. It just kind of gives me an easier time manipulating both of those types of effects. So I generally just find if I keep the color effects and the sharpening and light effects completely separate, I have a much easier time getting like cleaner color correction and just like manipulating the color effects much more easily. It's a very subtle thing, but it's just something that I've kind of just noticed over time. So I just do it that way just to, just make it a little bit easier for me. But one thing that I do is in the sharpening and the lighting camera raw filter, I'll actually go to the color grading, and I'm going to actually generally bring in some blues if it's this kind of warmer lighting. And what this is going to do is actually just kind of even out the lighting just a little bit, because I just feel like it's generally a little bit too warm straight off the bat. So this is without it, this is with it. Adding a little bit of blue just kind of neutrals out the lighting just a little bit more. And I feel like this helps when I go to the color correction too, because generally if I start adding some saturation in here, so if I just bring up some saturation, here, let's bring this to 0. If I start bringing up the saturation, you're gonna see the warm values just get really warm really quickly. But if I come back over here and I undo this and bring back in some of those blue values, this is just hemming down those warm values a bit more and just kind of making the whole image a little bit more kind of like neutral and just easier to work with. Because if I start bringing up the saturation now I've got a little bit more flexibility. I can kind of bring up the saturation a little bit higher, and the warms are still pretty warm, of course, but we're able to actually saturate like the other colors as well more evenly with this. So I obviously don't want to bring up this value to a point where you actually start seeing blue. You really only want to do this to a point where it just kind of looks just natural. Like you're not adding any color, you're just kind of removing the warm values essentially. So what I'll do, like how I'll find this color to choose, is I'll just kind of scroll through and just kind of very slowly move it through until this kind of just looks white. Like I'm just kind of also sometimes looking up here as well on my monitor at pure white and just trying to match the white sections on my image with, you know, actual pure white. So this is kind of green, so that's obviously bad. This is starting to turn pink and purple. But if I start coming right about here, now this is just looking like pure white basically, or at least pretty close to it. So then I'll bring it back down to 0 and just kind of slowly start raising it until it looks good, but you're not noticing actual blue color. So generally that's my workflow for this. I'm gonna click cancel because I already have the effects I like. So cancel all changes. All right, yeah, so this versus this. I feel like that always looks great. I just love sharpening and bringing up that brightness. That always makes the image look so much better. Color effects, pretty subtle. This is where I just kind of start adding some like more orangish, kind of reddish tones to the image. All right, so the color effects now. So as you can see right here, now it's a bit warmer and the color is just a little bit different, but nothing too crazy. Let me open up this now. And all right, so here is my color workflow. So as you can see right here, I have temperature. So this is kind of doing the same thing as I was doing before, just kind of removing some of those warm values by adding some cool values in here. It just looks a little bit different. It's a little bit more blue actually than the other one. So I don't use this nearly as often, but sometimes I do. And I have a little bit of saturation right here, but I actually don't really use much of the vibrance or saturation just because I like using the color mixer more. This gives you more fine control over each individual hue and how each individual hue looks on its own. When you're using a saturation or a vibrance slider, it controls basically everything at once. So like all of the warm and cool values at the same time, which can be good in certain cases, but this is nice because you can actually, you know, change the hue of like just the yellows, just the greens, just the blues, as well as the, you know, the saturation for each of those individual colors, and even the brightness of just each individual hue on its own. So this allows you to get much more fine control over the exact look of each individual color. And I just prefer this workflow much more. So generally on the oranges and yellows, I like to make it a little bit more like reddish, as you can see. Nothing too crazy. I don't want to go like super over the top. It just gets way too much pretty quickly. Generally on the yellows, I'll make it a little bit more orange. So as you can see right here, it just makes it a little bit more orange. And then greens. So this is something I love doing. So default is this, but I love bringing the green slider to the left. And sometimes I'll go pretty high on this, but it just kind of like gives this really nice kind of muted look to the greens that I always just really love to do. So that's one thing I like doing. Blues, this is very subtle, just kind of just remove some of that green from the blue up here, but nothing that's really noticeable at all. And then yeah, saturation, this is just kind of adjusting the saturation of any of the colors until I get the saturation amount that I need for each one. I didn't do any luminance in here just because I felt like the brightness was perfectly fine for all of that. So yeah, let's move on to the rest of the effects in here. Covered all of that. All right, so calibration. So in here, sometimes I'll move the blue slider to the left a little bit. So without this, and then with this is just very subtle. It just kind of gives this kind of nice warm effect. It makes the oranges kind of this like reddish orange, and then the blues are a little bit more of this kind of light blue or so. So too much of this can look kind of weird, but as with everything, if you keep it low or, you know, use it in moderation, it can turn out really well. Let's click OK. So yeah, before, after, pretty subtle, but I feel like it looks pretty good. Okay, now the volumetrics. So the volume pass, let me click this, disable layer mask, and then also set this from screen to normal. And then let's put this back to 100. All right, so the volume pass. So this just renders out only the volumetrics of your scene. And I feel like this just looks really good. I love this pass so much. It's super helpful in my process too. Basically what I do, I just use the mist pass. So this one right here, I just use this as a mask to basically mask out where I want to show the volume and where I don't want to show the volume. In this case, I actually painted over this a little bit too, to kind of just fade out these sections where the waterfall is. And this is mostly because I want the focal point in the foreground to not be faded as much as the background. So just basically you doing it this way, I can fade out the background and all of that a little bit more while keeping the foreground and the focal point way more sharp and clear and just, you know, a better point of focus. So I set this to screen, and then also I use a hue and saturation to just add some kind of cooler colors, just because I kind of find the warm lighting but cool volume just looks really cool. It's this kind of, I don't know, it's this nice effect that I've kind of found over time. Looks really cool. So yeah, that versus this, and I keep it pretty subtle sometimes. I think I had it around 26%, so pretty subtle, but it just fades out that background a little bit more and kind of just gives this nice kind of cool effect. And then in here, I basically just paint in some fog with like a cloud brush. Yeah, I just got a cloud brush right here. I just paint white basically, using this same exact mask. So I try to keep this very subtle. I just kind of use this in a way to kind of break up that kind of faded look and just kind of add some randomness and variation on, you know, like the brightness and darkness back there. Same thing here. I just kind of painted in some fog in front of the island, and then color overlays. So color overlay, this is pretty subtle too. Here, let me copy this value. So this, I just basically paint like orangish, kind of yellow, sometimes a little bit of green. And I set this to overlay, and I just paint that over different like highlights and stuff. So if I turn this off, you're gonna see it just brightens these highlights in the places I painted over quite a bit more. I try to keep this pretty subtle, but without it, with it, it just kind of helps with that kind of bright sunlit look. So especially on like sections like this, it just kind of helps it look like it's getting a lot more sunlight and it's just a lot more bright and saturated. And I also pair this up with this one as well, which is pretty much the exact same thing. I just kind of do this in a way that acts as like the sunlight. So if I turn it all the way up to 100, I just paint in the corner like this where the sun's coming from, and having it set to overlay, it just kind of saturates and brightens up that sunlight a little bit more in this section and just makes it look like there's sunlight coming from the left side. All right, this is very subtle too. This is just a color lookup. I have it set to fall colors. If I have this set to 100%, it's just like this very warm kind of faded LUT. I usually put this at a low value between like 5 to 20% maybe, just to kind of warm it up and kind of fade it a little bit. And then this right here is kind of like the final adjustments, just like one last kind of pass in the camera raw filter. So if I just go in here, I'll just kind of go through just like some of the lighting, some of the color, like sharpening, just like whatever the image really needs. I'll just kind of do these final touches in here. So nothing too crazy. I added a little bit of vignette. So just to kind of darken the sides, a little bit of lighting, not anything too crazy. I might have adjusted the colors a little bit. Nope, no color adjustments. Yeah, so nothing too crazy here, just a little bit of like final touches. So let's exit that. Contrast. So this right here, I just felt like I needed to darken some areas a little bit while keeping certain sections brighter. This is just the mask that I painted. So this is the exact same process as I did right here in the darks. I just kind of did it a little bit more subtly at the end as well. All right, then light rays, as you can see, the light rays are very subtle as well. I really only do this to kind of brighten up this section just slightly. It's set to 3 right now. If I put it all the way, you're gonna see this is actually what it looks like. It's literally just a light rays brush that I placed right here and then set to a super low value just to fade out this section just slightly. And then same with this. This is the lens flare, another very subtle effect, 22% if I bring this all the way up, and then I get rid of this mask. So disable layer mask. This right here is the lens flare effect. So basically you can actually just choose where the sun's coming from and then how that lens flare effect applies to your image. I try to line this up with the exact direction of the sun or something pretty close. And then I just use a mask to, And then I just use a mask to basically fade that part out just a little bit. So there's a little bit of brightness there, but nothing too over the top like it was before. And then, I don't know, I think it was like 22%. Yeah, and then I just move it down quite a bit on the fill just to make it pretty subtle. And then some just like last kind of final touches. So vibrance, just to make it a little bit more saturated. I don't even think you can really tell the difference on here. This is only, 4 on the saturation. Same with this. This is to fade it just slightly. If I click on this, oh yeah, I just moved that up 1. So I was just moving this up to fade the blacks, but I only moved it up 1. So it's just barely doing anything. It's just kind of brightening this section just slightly. All right, and then the overlays, which this is a pretty subtle effect. You may or may not be able to tell the difference. Yeah, like right here, it's kind of like these particles floating. So yeah, try to keep that super subtle too, because I don't want those to be super over the top or anything. But yeah, this is my workflow for pretty much a lot of my daytime scenes. I'll of course do something a little bit different every time, but I generally follow this pretty similar workflow for a lot of my post-processing. So yeah, hopefully that helped. And I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. And if you aren't already following NVIDIA Studio's YouTube, definitely give them a follow so you can stay tuned for their new videos. And that's going to wrap it up for this series as well. So I'll see you guys next time.